Hi everybody, hello, Nets Katz. How are you doing, Nets?
I'm doing fine.
So, Nets, welcome to our Gotributor podcast series. You are a professor of mathematics
I am.
from the University of...
I'm from Caltech, the California Institute of Technology.
Okay, and you want to come to the defense of the beleaguered creators of Game of Thrones.
Not at all. Not at all do I want to do that.
No. Oh, so what do you want to do?
I want to attack the whole enterprise from the top, including GRR Martin.
You want to throw Martin under the bus. This is what you want to do.
And I want to tell you this by first saying a little bit about where I come from and then saying a little bit about where he comes from.
Okay, go for it.
It's
blasphemy, but go for it.
So I feel I'm getting too old for this. When you ask, what is this? It's fandom. So I have been in, science fiction, fantasy fandom since I was 10 years old, maybe a little earlier. You might ask why, and so I want to start to answer that question because I'm trying to get you on board. So I want you to see similarities with the reason you are in fandom.
Okay, take me on this ride, Nets. Take me on this ride.
I don't know how much you know about the history of George R.R. Martin before Game of Thrones, before he started writing Song of Ice and Fire.
I've read one of his stories, A Song for Leia.
Okay, well, it's not that I know. It's not that I know all his work, but he grew up within science fiction fandom, which was at least in the 70s and 80s when he started a kind of unified thing. So he cared about winning Hugos. Hugo is this science fiction award that's awarded at Worldcon. And he interacted with fans all the time. And there were commercial reasons to interact with fans, because if you're a writer and you interact with the fans and you somehow win the game of interacting with the fans, then the fans can make your writing important. I mean, they can...
Okay.
I could mention other people for whom that happened to a slightly lesser extent than it ended up working out for George R.R. Martin. But, like, for instance, C.J. Cherryh would be a writer who... Okay, well, she's published some ridiculous number of books, and basically it happened because fans discovered her. And so, so in fact, there was a kind of reason to try to play this game of appealing to the fans, which was a commercial reason. And George R.R. Martin was very good at it. And, he still belongs to this world to a certain extent. You may have read his entry into the Sad Puppies scandal. I don't know if you know about the Sad Puppies scandal.
No, I do not.
So at some point in the last 5 or 10 years, there was some kind of a takeover of Worldcon, of the method of awarding Hugos, by a group of people who felt that science fiction had become too woke and literary. And so they were called the Sad Puppies. And they thought that the solution to the problem was to make everything very pulpy, to make all fiction just total pulp. I know it sounds a little bit like what I said I liked, but they kind of wanted it without ideas. So just, adventure stories with no ideas. That was what they wanted. And they tried to take over science fiction, and there was a big internet kerfuffle about this. And George R. R. Martin wrote a number of blog posts about why they're bad, which were completely sensible blog posts. I'm basically with him. So he said it wasn't about politics. He would be happy to read Heinlein because Heinlein had ideas, but these people were pushing fiction that had no ideas, and that's just dumb. And my point is just that he belongs to this world. He's not totally foreign to me. And in fact,
organically grown in this world.
He organically grew in this world. He got a job in television, which at the time was not prestige television. It was in the U.S. controlled by the 3 broadcast networks. And he became really famous for a show called Beauty and the Beast. And I don't know if you know what Beauty and the Beast was. But it was a show in the late 80s and early 90s about people who lived underground under New York City. And the Beast was such a person, and the Beauty was some journalist in New York. And it was kind of a popular show. It lasted for three seasons, and that was where George R. R. Martin really made his name. In fact, the show died because they killed off the heroine. So you might say that George R. R. Martin was really perfecting the craft that he carried out later at that time.
Just killed it too much.
Yes,
too
they
much
just...
of it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just the fans of the show, whoever they were really fans of this heroine. So in the 3rd season, when suddenly the heroine was gone, it really didn't make sense anymore, and it was shortly canceled. So we were kind of self-exiles. We were living in Texas, having abandoned the establishment. That is, my father had abandoned the establishment. When this was happening, I was hearing it never in English, but only in Hebrew, Hamimsad. We were not part of Hamimsad. We were external to Hamimsad, and we were plotting all kinds of rebellions, and we were plotting taking over the world, because that was the kind of thing that my father liked to do.
Was he a villain, a superhero villain?
Well, it may take too long to discuss the details of that, maybe another time. But you just accept this picture that there's my father, and there's my sister and me, and we're living in this kind of existence where paternal approval is important. And so my sister was much better at this than I was. So whenever she liked something, it was because it had a really great use for world domination.
It sounds a little bit like Ender's Games also. Like Ender's Game? No?
I think I had... I'm not sure. So my sister liked Star Trek. Star Trek was the primary fandom in those days. We're talking about the early 1980s. So Star Trek got canceled in the late 60s, and there grew up this gigantic fandom around it, which had conventions meeting everywhere, and basically that fandom also dovetailed with all of science fiction fandom and all of fantasy fandom, because there weren't that many conventions, so everyone went to the same conventions. Part of what went on in science fiction fandom was a very small subsect of that science fiction fandom, which was called filk, where people just wrote songs, either writing their own music or borrowing somebody else's music and writing new lyrics for it about the science fiction that they liked. And this is something that my sister really wanted to do because she could write lyrics better than anybody. I mean, she was really good at this. But she had no musical talent whatsoever. So that presented a problem when you wanted to interact with filkers, because most filkers were people who could play guitar and sing their own songs and do things like that. And she didn't have any of that. And so for that reason, she dragged me along, mostly to make a fool of myself. But I was just supposed to sing her songs to them. And this is how, when I was 9 or 10 years old, I became acquainted with fandom. And so I would...
And you started out as like the object of ridicule as you were 9, or you were the cute kid?
I was the cute kid.
Okay, go on.
And so I went to these conventions, and I saw what fandom was, and I saw many kinds of fans, and you can make stereotypes of those kind of fans, and I could say that some of these stereotypes occur in stronger, weaker ways among your own patrons. And also I kind of saw some of the flaws in the whole theory about why this should be useful for conquering the world. So maybe I should explain that theory a little more. So
that would be a good time.
So part of the theory was that science fiction, it was fantasy too, but somehow we were more focused on science fiction because that was what we liked. Science fiction was not really part of the establishment. So there was a literary establishment for literature, which was all modern. You know, it was all following whatever trends existed in the literary world. But science fiction, being kind of pulpy, was free of that. And so all sorts of things could exist in science fiction that couldn't exist elsewhere.
For example?
For example, kind of romantic or heroic fiction. So romantic or heroic fiction might have been dominant in the 19th century, but in the 20th century it was really not in literary circles. But it still existed to a certain extent in science fiction, along with a bunch of trash, you know. So, I mean, it's a mix of things.
Was that different? Was that different from fantasy, from the fantasy genre at the time? Which was more establishment fantasy?
I would not say so. I think fantasy was also anti-establishment, and it was also part of the same subculture. So the fantasy people went to the same conventions we did. An example of a fantasy that I was interested in those days was ElfQuest. I don't know if you know what that is. No. ElfQuest was a comic book by Wendy and Richard Penny. But
I started with Dragonlance. Have you read Dragonlance?
I don't know what that is.
Dragonlance. That's like dragon, like D&D stuff. And actually, just today, I jogged to the beach. On my way back, I stumbled on a stand with books that says "Pick Me Up" in all kinds of languages. I looked around and I found a Dragonlance book, and I picked it up and I put it here on my thing. It's like for my generation, let's say people born in the late 70s, early 80s, that was like the first fantasy book that everybody read.
I have to say I took a long break. So after I went to college, I wasn't doing this seriously anymore, so I have some cultural gaps. But in any case, so then we had this kind of theory about all of the fans. So our theory about the fans was that, of course, the fans were fans because they were anti-establishment too. And so the reason that doing this fandom was going to help take over the world is that we were going to appeal to this audience of anti-establishment fans. Now, of
Okay.
course, you might know that there exist other theories of why fans are fans. So I would point you to a Saturday Night Live skit from the 80s that William Shatner did, which is kind of famous, in which he
Okay.
completely mocks his fans
Oh
and
no.
describes them as sort of losers. And it's
Oh
definitely
no.
true that you see, you know, a lot more autism among your fans and a lot less being socially adept. And so
Okay.
the real truth of it, in my opinion, was that it wasn't so much that they were anti-establishment as that the establishment had kind of rejected them, so they wanted to belong to a more forgiving establishment and worship a more
Uh,
forgiving establishment that would take
I,
them.
I like it. This is a good way, an empathetic way to describe it. Yeah.
Well, it's just who they were. And I mean, I could tell you more
Okay.
stories, and the purpose here is not to tell you stories about fans. But so
Okay.
then there were the authors, right? I mean, there were people in this fandom who weren't the fans. They were people that the fans were fans of. And there were, of
Yeah.
course, the way there always are, kind of different levels of importance among the authors. But the sad thing was that very few, if any of them, were kind of the way we would have imagined them, were
Huh.
people who were kind of literary geniuses who were trying to carry out their literary vision here. Most of them were trying to make a living, which is a normal
Hmm.
thing to do. I mean, it's
Yeah. And
understandable.
heroic in its own way.
Well, not so exciting to us.
Up to now, it sounds that you have good thoughts and opinions and experiences from the fandom and from being involved in this fandom. Sounds like it was part of
I'm
your.
exaggerating. Okay. Well, I mean, I definitely miss it, you know? So when I think about myself, I definitely miss interacting with those kinds of people. I miss singing songs. I miss having people to listen to and people who listen to me, and to be sure I miss that, but I don't feel I was getting very close to taking over the world, and I don't feel that they were really anti-establishment. I felt like they were going to be fans of whatever there was to be fans of. So if you give them Star Trek, they'll be fans of Star Trek. And if you give them Beauty and the Beast, they'll be fans of Beauty and the Beast. And okay, if you give them total crap, they won't be fans of the total crap. But they're really just, you know, exist in the world, and they're waiting for whatever is going to come up that there's going to be a fandom of, and they're going to be fans of that. And I think this
Okay.
is kind of related to what you wanted from Game of Thrones, at least parts of what you want from Game of Thrones. So Game of Thrones gave you this Patreon business, right? Because there's this vast fandom of Game of Thrones.
Huge business. Huge business.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to insult. I actually am trying very hard not to project my desires for you on you. I kind of desire you to be this idealistic rebel who wants to change the world by interacting with this fandom that just showed up, and you know, I'm very impressed when you succeed in this. So I'm like very impressed when you get to be a political commentator on Israeli television based on the support you have from the Game of Thrones fandom. I mean, that's incredible. But of course, I know you live in reality, and I'm sure that your goals are much more sensible goals than the goals I want to project for you.
Okay, to take over the world, I'm not sure I want to take over the world, but I would like to move it to a better direction than where it's heading now. I feel like I'm doing my part as best I can. But
okay,
how
so now I've been taken kind of afield that I haven't quite given my verdict of George R.R. Martin. I really think George R.R. Martin is just taking advantage of everyone. That that George R.R. Martin kind of exists within this world in which there are fandoms, and his primary goal is to make a living in it. And I think that the first three books of Song and Ice and Fire, I think Game of Thrones, Storm of Swords, I've forgotten.
Clash of Kings,
were really good books and were a kind of self-contained trilogy. And I would not, exaggerate as much as you the extent to which he had ideas about how he was going to explain exactly what good governance was, or that really the purpose of the books was to describe a development in which magic disappears and we come into the modern world. I think it's just that he had some ideas about kind of unrealistic features of the epics that we all think of, and he certainly contributed all these ideas about how people whose politics are bad, people who are bad at the technical aspects of doing politics will lose. And he incorporated those things into his novels much more than was done before. But I think it was all a bit of a lark. And the first three novels got written relatively quickly, right? 5 or 6 years for 3 novels. And that was because that was what came out of him. And he had the advantage of being very well connected with the fandom, so they were good novels to begin with, and he had very good ways of reaching the fans, and it all worked. So he became right there kind of the leader of the genre at that moment. And then I think he got a little tired of it. There's more than one way of writing yourself into a corner. But he had written himself into the corner of having this complex built world, no way in his mind to really close it. I think even the 4th and the 5th book are not so ideal, really pretty junky.
So you would say that the, subconsciously, unconsciously, doesn't want to go through with it because he wrote himself into a corner, and it's something that he's not able, and maybe nobody's able to do it, and that was maybe the main reason, or at least half the reason, or whatever, for the way that the story on the HBO show collapsed, because there was no way to get out of it gracefully, shall I say.
Well, maybe there were ways to get out of it gracefully. Let's say you had been in charge of it. If you had been in charge of it, then the whole thing was building up to Queen Sansa, and only the plots that are connected to it becoming Queen Sansa were really important, and the other plots were not so important, and they would be kind of connected in this coherent way because of this coherent goal.
No, I think that the Queen Sansa goal was basically a representation of the end game of the story being the changing of the historical era, being the death of magic, the involvement of Essos in
I
Westeros.
agree. I agree. But the point is, that's an idea. That's an idea about how the story should end. And when you have a coherent idea, then maybe you can produce the story coherently to converge to it. But I don't think Martin had that coherent idea. In fact, I have a theory of the idea that Martin actually did have. This is based on my believing what Isaac Hempstead Wright said. So I believe that somebody told him that Bran becoming king was in fact Martin's idea. And I know that sounds a little self-serving from his point of view, but I just don't think of him as that self-serving a person. I mean, he was also describing how shocked he was that this was happening.
Yeah.
And so
he might not know the details, but he might be right.
Okay, so I have a theory about how that could be what George R. R. Martin was aiming for. And in fact, I would support that theory by looking at some of the stuff going on in the middle books, which really shouldn't be there if his goal were the goal that you were talking about. Like, he really likes this magic. He really likes warging. There are descriptions after descriptions of warging. Right. It's not just Bran who's a warg, but also Arya is a warg. Right. And there are openings about wargs. There's all this Lady Stoneheart stuff that the right. D&D probably pretty wisely got rid of. That's there for some reason.
Yeah, I didn't like it.
So I think he actually likes the magic. I think he actually wants to be a fantasy writer and thinks that part of being a fantasy writer is liking the magic. Just if you do it correctly, you have to go easy on the magic so that the whole story doesn't become Deus Ex Machina. It's too bad that he didn't want to write the Rise of the Modern World story, because the Rise of the Modern World story is an interesting story. But definitely. My message to you is, what do you need him for? And the answer is, what you need him for is that without him, you don't have these patrons. But now you have them. And seriously, what do you need him for? Why do we have to behave like fans all the time, where we look at what's dominant in the culture and we say we have to follow the thing that's dominant in the culture? Why can't we be rebels, and why can't we make our own thing eventually?
Yeah. You know what? So let's put Martin aside for a second and let's talk about Game of Thrones. Actually, okay. What you're saying, I feel that this is what I've done this past season. I'm like, I don't care what the establishment told me that the story is and that the conclusion is. No, I don't care. I've told my story. It's not only my story, it's also Itamar's story, Noga's story, right?
Sure.
A lot of people involved in it. And I think that our story is better than Dan and Dave's story. And for me, this is still the story. I don't care what they said. And you know what? And if Martin writes at the end that it's Bran, first of all, I have to assume that he will make it make sense.
Sure.
But even assuming that, I will still say, you know what? I liked my story better. In that sense, I feel that I've been doing it, and that's the only way for me to keep creating and collaborating on Game of Thrones content, is just like to tell my story and not caring about what D&D said, and that the conclusion is we're recording this on Sunday, June 23rd. So on Tuesday, 2 days from now, Noga and I will do our first like a TED Talk style in a bar. and if it works, then that will be we'll have more of those. And like talking about the psychoanalytical side of the story. And here we're gonna tell a whole different story about how to emotionally connect with these characters. And if it works, we'll be able to tell that side of the story, you know, to all kinds of crowds, offline crowds, let's say.
Oh, okay, so what I was going to say was that you're in danger of angering Martin by doing this, because, you know, he opposes fan fiction.
Yeah, it's not fan fiction. It's just like storytelling. Storytelling. It's not the same.
That's actually what fan fiction is. It's very funny. Of course, a lot of fan fiction is absolute garbage. It's completely true because it's fan fiction, so anyone can do it. And there isn't really a filter that gets rid of the garbage. But in fact, in the Star Trek world, there was so much of this that some of the fan fiction is actually better than anything that got written in Star Trek. And if you permit kind of a world where there's fan fiction, then you can have all flowers blooming. So you can have a bunch of garbage and you can have some real gems. But Martin is really famous about despising fan fiction, and on the strict property argument, it makes sense. You know, he says, this belongs to me, how dare you write about it? But in fact, it's again a bid for establishment control. You know, he's the establishment, and he should control what it's about. The real victory would be when you can make a fandom of your own, when you can just create some sort of a setting in which your patrons or your live action patrons at bars or whatever audience you have can work with you to create the thing that you want to create. I think this is sort of the tragedy of fandom. So I've been talking about fandom from beginning to end, and the tragedy of fandom is that it's passive. You have to be a fan of something that somebody else made. And the real successful revolution is when you make it your thing.
So you're right that Martin is very famous for being against fan fiction, and think of the tragedy of this man who created his his greatest story ever. That story that made him famous and that made his dislike of fan fiction also famous, and he gave away that story to two people who made it into fan fiction, into very, very low quality fan fiction. That's, I think, a real tragedy. That it's like Oedipus, like trying so hard not to give it away to that direction, ran all the way to the other side and ended up in the same place. That is a good story. The way that we create content is not from the specific show that is now this or that. It's from an interesting concept and talking about it through something that a lot of people watch or read. This is the way, I think, to make a better conversation and to create like a more original content, not just like review. Okay, so this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It's like I want to talk about about human evolution in different planets and different environments. I'm going to do that through The Expanse. I want to talk about connections between humans and animals. I'm going to do that through Daenerys and Drogon. I want to talk about philosophical concepts. I'm going to do that through Black Mirror, etc., 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 etc. Okay, so people, please, if you're on Patreon, please join this discussion. And thank you, Nets, for sharing this story and your thoughts on the fandom. So thank you everybody for listening in, and let's tell them bye. Bye everybody.
Bye.